Welcome back. The Senate will consider legislation to make big changes to the way the Defense Department and the services handle cases of domestic abuse. One provision of that bill would take decisions away from commanders and give them to prosecutors. Brenda Farrell is Director of Defense Capabilities and Management Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Brenda, thanks for coming back on the program. You just completed some work on this issue, the issue of domestic abuse in the military. What did you look at in your work?
We looked at everything, all the different phases of domestic abuse, from awareness, how does the family advocacy programs advertise to service members and their families, the services that they have, how to go about with a report. We looked at statutory requirements to DoD to provide data to help with oversight. We did look at data available on commanders' decisions to move forward with the case or not to take any action. And we looked at training. We looked at a whole host of issues. As you know, Congress has had a long-standing interest in domestic abuse going all the way back to 2000 when they tasked DoD with commissioning a task force on domestic violence. And there's been a number of reports that we've put out as well as others on this issue. But this is the first time in 20 years that we've taken this broad of a look at domestic abuse in DoD.
There are a number of themes in this work, Brenda, and one of the themes seems to be that DoD is doing part of what's necessary or part of what's prescribed by legislation, but doesn't have the whole picture. One example, you write, DoD met a statutory requirement to collect and report data for incidents that it determined met its criteria for domestic abuse, but it hasn't collected and reported accurate data for all domestic abuse allegations received. Is that the challenge, is that the Pentagon has taken some of the action that it's supposed to or needs to, but hasn't gone all the way in a lot of these areas?
That's correct. They have taken some action. They did meet the requirement that you mentioned. It's DoD met criteria for domestic abuse, but they haven't taken steps to actually clean up the data regarding the rest of the allegations that include domestic violence. Domestic violence is a subset of domestic abuse. Domestic violence falls under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. These are criminal offenses, and DoD is mandated to report on those offenses as well as commanders' actions taken. And we found that even though there had been a statutory requirement for DoD to establish a database to collect such data related to domestic violence as well as the commander's actions, there was no database that contained this information. DoD has struggled with an approach to get this information. They resorted to going to the DoD met criteria cases and pulling from that incidents that were related to domestic violence and commanders' actions. The problem is that where they were pulling from is just a subset itself. It's not the total number of cases dealing with domestic violence. The other problem is incidents that met DoD criteria is not the same as domestic violence cases that fall under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. In other words, there's not everything captured. Under the Code of Military Justice, for example, incidents that are related to violations of military protective orders could be prosecuted, whereas that's not considered when DoD is classifying domestic abuse cases under its DoD met criteria.
Brenda, you write the military services have developed domestic abuse prevention and response training for key personnel that meets some DoD requirements. I underlined the word some while I was reading your report in kind of that ongoing theme that I mentioned earlier, that the Pentagon's got part of the work done and hasn't gotten all of the work done. Am I reading that right, Brenda?
That's right. As I noted earlier, we've looked at the different phases of domestic abuse prevention and response. And as far as the training goes, there are specific requirements. There's 16 of them that DoD lays out in its policy for the services to use to develop the training for commanders as well as senior enlisted. And there's other training for all service members as well. We did a content analysis looking at that specific training and found that not all the services followed what that guidance should be and what should be covered. And there's a lot of key areas of responsibilities that commanders have, as well as senior enlisted, that they need to know in order to make the right decisions regarding how to handle such cases. But you've got it. DoD's taken some action to get the correct data. They've taken some action toward awareness for their service members and their families. They've taken some action. But I think it's important to keep in mind that many of these issues were brought to DoD's attention as far back as 1999, and they have been struggling for the last 2 decades to fully develop their prevention and training response program.
Brenda Farrell of the Government Accountability Office, thanks very much for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Francis.